weekend. Again. And so they got married, I guess maybe on Thursday or Friday. I can't remember what day Rhonda mentioned it, but they're out of town for that, and the Hunts are out of town. I think this is the weekend of their anniversary as well. So lots of folks traveling. Want to keep them in our prayers. All right, looking at the matter of the organization of the church, we studied the last couple of Sundays, at least when I was teaching, about the matter of the apostles. And now going to move from Ephesians chapter 4 to the matter of what is referred to as pastors and teachers. Pastors and teachers. And as I've said many times before, the word pastor should have never, ever, ever appeared in our Bibles. It's just a terrible rendering, but it's a rendering based on religious error. By the way, and I've made mention of this, but in case somebody might be watching or hearing this for the first time, the reason the word pastor was mentioned is because by the time that the New Testament was being translated into English, the apostasy and the religious error of church organization was well established, and thus there were divisions in religious denominationalism that cannot be found, religious hierarchies in denominationalism that could not be found in the Bible, and thus the renderings reflected those things. And the word pastor should have never ever appeared in our Bibles. The word bishop, 1 Timothy 3 and verse 1, we'll find that verse and that office, or so to speak, in our study today. The word bishop should have never ever appeared in our Bibles, because the word is overseer. But because the religious world had established offices such as pastorates and bishops and such things, they translated these things in reflection of their current religious practices. Baptism should never have appeared in our Bibles because there's a word for it. It's the word immersion. And so it was interesting, just by way of introduction, there is a tremendous amount of controversy going on among the Baptists in the United States, particularly the Southern Baptists, over the matter of women preachers. I mean, if you're following the news or you follow religious news, there is a huge controversy right now over the matter of women preachers. And among the leading Baptist and evangelicals, there has been an endorsement of a woman, and I think her last name is White. I can't think of her first name, but she was recently identified as one of President Trump's spiritual advisors. All right? Now, this woman has been married 3 times, and she's currently married to a guitar player from some rock band, I believe. And but she has been married 3 times, and she is a preacher or a pastor. And many of the leading evangelicals, I guess, in trying to curry the favor of the president, have endorsed this woman. And people who have rejected this movement and tried to at least hold on to what the Bible says about women pastors or preachers have condemned these who have endorsed her. There's another woman who has been rising up through the ranks of popularity, particularly among Baptist women, and she has started preaching. And there was a forum, and I just watched this. Well, matter of fact, I watched it twice while I was in Texas, and I can't. There's 2 different ones. There's the woman that's been divorced like 3 times, and there's another one who has her own church, like in the Dallas area. But but this one has also been endorsed by a number of leading evangelicals. And so, but it was John MacArthur Jr., who's not a Baptist, but I believe he's a Presbyterian. He's a hardline Calvinist, but he came out extremely strongly against women preachers. And there was a link or a site on my Facebook feed from a young Baptist preacher that I'm a friend with on Facebook, and he came out against it. Now, the problem is, in his attempt to teach that women ought not be preachers, he used 1 Timothy 3 in verse 1 and following. Why? Because he has a misunderstanding about what a preacher is and what a pastor is. And so he went to 1 Timothy 3, which is the qualifications for the eldership, to show why women ought not be preachers. Now, his position is right. But his defense of his position is totally off base. You don't go to 1 Timothy 3 to prove why women ought not be preachers, because that doesn't have anything to do with it. And so going back to where I started, this idea of this misunderstanding about pastors and preachers and should women be pastors and should women be, because people have abandoned the truth on this matter. They can't even defend their correct position properly. And so that's why not only is it important to believe the truth, it's also important to understand why we believe the truth. Lest we make bad, I think Johnny and I have talked about this recently, about making bad arguments, and then Billy and I talked about it a lot through the course of the last week. But not in that case, but in a lot of our own brethren's case, about different things that are perhaps troubling the brotherhood, that even preachers are prone to make bad arguments to defend what they believe, or to try to tell somebody else that what they believe is wrong. And so it's not just, it's not just a denominational issue. It's a problem with all professed believers. But we want to see what the Bible says. And on on page 111, Stroop's not going to deal with the matter of teachers in Ephesians 4. He's going to deal with the word pastors. And in the first full paragraph, begins there with the word. It says, the word that should have been used in this place. He gave some apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers. He said the word here for pastors, that's rendered pastors in Ephesians 4, should have been shepherds. It says this is the only place in the New Testament record where the Greek word here used by Paul is translated as anything but shepherds. In other words, let's just say there's a dozen times it appears in Paul's writings, and 11 out of 12 times it appears as shepherds, and yet one time it appears as pastor. What's the point? Well, the point is somebody didn't do a good job of translation. And so, kind of like the word Easter in the book of Acts, that Acts 12, I believe it's Acts 12, that Herod intended to wait until after Easter to put Peter to death. Well, that word appears about 100 times in the New Testament, and 99 times it's Passover, but somehow it managed to make its way into Easter one time. Now, is that a good translation or not? I'm pretty sure it is not. And this is the same situation. It says, looking at it says, in the preceding lesson, this word is used to speak of the same people that are called, and again, this is called by translation, bishops, overseers, and elders. Of these terms, probably the one that is most commonly used among us is elders. So in this discussion, we are concerned with the place of the elders and the organization of the church. All right, so we're just going to use the term elders consistently. He's just going to use the term elders consistently for the most part through the rest of this lesson, but with the understanding that we all understand that from the biblical text, the translations, pastors, shepherds, bishops, overseers, and elders all refer to the same group of individuals. And he hates the word office, by the way, if you read through, and we're going to take him to task over that if we get to it. I spent a lot of time on sometimes he just wants to prove something so bad that he kind of gets out of his lane, and so we'll talk about that. If you've read the lesson ahead of time, you already know that. Now, in the bottom paragraph, it says, if we're going to understand the place and work of the elders, so we must not overlook the fact that we are dealing with a relationship, and that relationship must be considered in its entirety. Now, what he means by that is that both sides and all angles of that relationship have to be given consideration. For example, it's been, it's probably been 20 years. I could go back and look it up, but 20 years ago, I preached a series of sermons on church relationships. And one of those sermons was on the relationship of the church to the elders. The other lesson was the relationship of the elders to the church. In other words, looking at it from both directions in order to get a proper view. And so that's where this lesson is going to focus. It's not focused on the qualifications of the elders, by the way, which is a profitable and very helpful study. And we probably need to go back and look at some of those things in the near future. But this is just dealing with the relationship that the elders have with the church and the church with the elders. And so in the bottom of page 111, he talks about the misunderstanding that seems to pervade or be prevalent among our people with regard to the eldership. And there's some of what he says is true, but some of what he says, I think, is trying to overstate his case. All right, now over to page 112. In the third line, you see where it begins with for example. Now, what he's going to say, he's going to set forth an example of how we have emphasized certain aspects of relationships without examining the other side of the relationships. For example, he says much emphasis has been given about children obeying their parents, but little about parents not provoking their children to wrath. All right? Now, that may be true, but he expresses it anecdotally. In other words, this is my experience, therefore I'm going to state it as a fact. I don't know that it's necessarily a fact. I think I've talked about both sides of that relationship a lot in the last 20 some odd years. And what I found particularly interesting is that if you got your House to House, Heart to Heart in the mail this week, volume 24, number 10, the back page article, which I did not write, but was rather what's called the standard issue. If you don't submit something, it's the article that goes on everybody's copy unless you submit something for your own back page. Guess what the article is on the back of House to House, Heart to Heart, this issue? Parents provoke not your children to wrath. And so I thought it was interesting that he states as a fact that we don't teach on this, and yet there's about 2.5 million copies of it, or 3 million copies of it that went out this week, basically all around the country and also all around the world. And so I think he's trying to make his case based on anecdotal evidence, and that's no way to build your case. Then he says, also the teaching of wives be in subjection to your own husbands has been strongly preached, but the instruction, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it, has been seldom mentioned. Again, where's the proof for that? There is none. I mean, Go through. Again, this book was written in 1963. Maybe it was true in 1963, but I promise you, it's not been true. Well, it's not been true here. For the last 20-something years, I know it's not been true. Go and look at any of our brotherhood lectureships that have to do with the home, and see if there's not one sermon on wives, submit yourselves to your husbands, and see if there's not one the very next hour on husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church. Again, the evidence is simply what he perceives to be true, and I don't think it's necessarily true. Let me just add this as a flying monkey wrench, right? So you better duck. I got to think about this. I would say that in the period of time, but I think this book was written in 62 or 63. Right? In the period of time from 62 to 2019, do you think there has been more teaching on wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as unto the Lord, or less over the last 50 or 60 years? Generally speaking. Less. Again, I can't prove that. It'll be my anecdotal evidence. But it seems to me, not only in the church, but especially in denominationalism, there has been less emphasis on wives be in submission to your own husbands as unto the Lord. Now why? Why is there less?
Well, I think it's because they believe marriage and remarriage and divorce and all that stuff.
All right, there's one reason. There's less respect for the institution of marriage. What's another one? That's not the one I was thinking about, though. Thank you, Sheila. The Equal Rights Amendment, that was the ERA when we were in the 70s. All right? The women's rights or the women's liberation movement. All right? So churches want to try to keep butts in the seats or count noses, and so you can't preach certain things very much or very strongly, or people won't like it and they'll leave. Now, 20 or 25 years ago, the Southern Baptist Convention released a statement about the role of men and women in the home. And by the way, their statement was almost verbatim Ephesians 5:23 to 29. I mean, they almost quoted verbatim what the Bible says. And the left-wing media and left-wing religionists went absolutely bonkers. How dare you say such a thing, that women ought to be in submission to their own husbands? You think women are second-class citizens. You believe in the subjugation of women. And they said, wait a minute. We just said what the Bible said. All we said was what the Bible said. But the media and leftists, and by the way, people that don't even go to church, it's almost like a giant Facebook pile-on before there ever was Facebook. That's what it boiled down to. And so the reason I think it's without a shadow of a doubt, just based on the response. And by the way, I was not a supporter of the Promise Keepers movement back in the 80s and 90s. It was a movement for men to teach them biblical. It was a denominational thing about getting guys to take the lead in their home and in their spiritual life and for their families and whatnot. I mean, I think the overall thing the intent was good, but I wasn't a backer of it. But when that thing hit big time, again, the media and left-wing religionists just went nuts. They just went nuts about it. And so I think there's been less and less preaching on the proper role of men and women in the home, particularly as it pertains to women and their relationship to their husbands. Now, having said all that, I firmly believe that's one reason why there's been a tremendous rise in divorce in the last 50 or 60 years. Because people don't, as Walter said, they don't understand or appreciate the sanctity of marriage. They don't understand the proper role of men and women in marriage. And when you try to take all men and turn them into Woody Allen or Alan Alda, when you try to sissify them and you don't let men be men, then marriages suffer. Marriages will suffer, then there'll be divorce. Now, is that true or not true? I mean, has not the media and leftists among us, have they not been trying to emasculate men over the last 50 years? Say that men ought to be more like women? And are they not saying that women are encouraging women to be more like men rather than being what God made them? Now let me ask you a question. You think that contributes to the destruction of the home?
Yes.
Has to. It has to. And so what Stroop says here, I find, since this book was written, the very opposite to be true. The very opposite to be true. All right, so now back to the subject at hand, page 112. Sorry about that, but that's been weighing on my mind for a while. This whole thing just. By the way, we need to be able to tell people why women ought not be preachers, and we ought to be able to tell people the difference between what the Bible calls a pastor and a preacher. All right, so there's that. Now, middle of that big long paragraph, it says, in the relationship of the elders to the church and the church to the elders, people have preached long and loud, you must obey the elders. But they have had little to say about the obligations of the elders to the assembly of God's people. Now, I would tend to agree with that statement. That I think there has been, again, among our people, an overemphasis on the relationship of the church to the elders and not so much study and preaching done with regard to the responsibilities of the elders to the church. I mean, I think we've all either used or heard the term obey the elders or obey our elders.
In the Lord, for this is right.
In the Lord. They're over you in the Lord. All right? So I understand, because that terminology is found in our Bibles. All right? Obey them that have the rule over you, as those that watch for your souls. Hebrews 13:7.
You're going to have to give an answer.
Yeah, as those who have to give an account. Right. Hebrews 13:7 and 17. And so there has been perhaps a lot of emphasis on our responsibility. And now let me take a step back and explain why. In the 1980s and 1990s, there was a movement in the church to say that elders only have authority insofar as they have example. That the elder's authority is only by example. By the way, the first church I ever worked with full time, the one that fired me after 13 weeks, a bunch of those knuckleheads believed that. Now, what did it boil down to? They didn't respect the eldership. Because not only were they arguing against any authority in the eldership, they were claiming that their authority was only in their example, and yet they weren't willing to follow their example. So you don't argue for one thing against another when you're not willing to at least do what you're arguing for. Okay? So there was a movement during that time about the authority of the eldership. Well, what tends to happen when we have difficulties? There's many times an overreaction to a doctrine. And then there's too much teaching on this side of it and not enough on the other side. And by the way, look, I realize that where we live and where most of you have lived all your lives, this hasn't been an issue. But trust me, as a person who lived in Nashville, St. Louis, Arizona, these things have been problems. We have been, and by we I mean this area, we have been inoculated from so many church problems because all of our brothers and sisters are faithful. Right? I mean, you think about, any one of us could go down to White House or Barn Creek, and sit down there in the pew for a year. and hear the same type of preaching, the same respect for the Bible that you would get at this place. You see? And so we've been kind of insulated against a lot of the things that I've seen because I've been, out and about. So some of these things may sound strange to you, like you've never heard them before, but be thankful. Be thankful that we live among so many faithful brethren. All right, now back to the book. It says, we should not lose sight of the fact that such careless and dishonest handling of the Bible, I don't think dishonest is the right word, it is careless, tends to breed disrespect. Neither should we overlook the fact that when one fails to fulfill his obligation in any relationship as best he can, he has no right to the privileges afforded by the relationship, and the relationship will cease to be effective. This is just as true in the elder-church relationship as in any other. In other words, if an elder doesn't properly fulfill the role of an elder, then whether or not he has the title has no bearing on his effectiveness as an elder. That's what Stroop is saying here. In other words, just having the title is no guarantee that the relationship is going to be healthy and productive. A person can have the title of husband. You got husband and wife, but simply having those titles is no guarantee that the relationship is going to be healthy, right? Parents and children, those are basically titles or positions, and there's no guarantee that just because those things exist that they're going to be healthy or successful. What is the one thing that makes all of those things healthy or successful? And that is fulfilling the role that is demanded by the place. Fulfilling the role that is demanded by the place or the position. All right, third line from the bottom. Therefore, the elder who fails to fulfill his obligations loses his privileges of leadership, whether he loses his place as an elder or not. That's right. Again, just having the title doesn't mean that the person's serving in that role or performing that function. Now, on page 113, man, there was I thought this was really, really good stuff right here. On page 113. And that is the case that when Jesus spoke to the apostles, He never spoke to them in terms that they were supposed to be bosses over the church. He never spoke to them in that way. But He did speak to them. Now, in a passage that's not in this section that I think is important to note. But just note in about the, sixth line down in the middle of the column there, it says, when Jesus was here, He stressed the fact that among His people there should be equality. Jesus cautioned His disciples, but be not ye called rabbi, for one is your teacher, and all of you are brethren. And call no man your father on the earth, for one is your Father, even He who is in heaven. Neither be ye called masters, for one is your master, even Christ. So he's laying a foundation of equality. Now look, earlier in his statement to the 12, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. Not so shall it be among you. But whosoever would become great among you shall be your minister. And whoever would be first among you shall be your servant. Now that's to the 12. That's to the apostles. Now look at the last one. At the Last Supper, there arose a contention among them, which of them was accounted to be the greatest. All the way to the end of the ministry of Christ, we are finding that the apostles are still jockeying for position among themselves. All right? Now, Jesus in Matthew 20 has already explained to them, your thinking is Gentile thinking. Now, that alone should have jarred them awake. No Jew would want to be accused of thinking like a Gentile, right? Because they were disgusted by Gentiles. They didn't want any dealings with Gentiles. So he's already accused their thinking of being Gentile-like. But that didn't bring them out of their stupor of wanting to be the best. So he says, there arose a contention among them, which of them would be accounted to be the greatest. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles have lordship over them, and they that have authority over them are called benefactors. But you shall not be so. Talking to the 12. You shall not be so. He that is greater among you, let him become as the younger, and he that is chief as he that doth serve. So Jesus, in speaking to his apostles, tells them that there needs to be an equality among them and their brethren, and there needs to be an equality among them as a group of apostles. Now, the reason this is important is because, let me ask you a question. In the early church, the earliest days of the church, who had the greatest authority in the church? After Christ was risen, the church was established. Who had the greatest authority in the church? What group of people? The apostles. That's right. The apostles had the greatest amount of authority. Because Jesus gave to the apostles, whatsoever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven, and whatsoever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. Now, what they were teaching was not theirs. Nevertheless, they taught it with authority. And they had the power to bind those things. Then, after the earliest days of the church, then you start finding that the church has another group of men. Elders. We studied this 2 weeks ago. When a collection was taken up in Acts 12 because of the famine, it says they sent the money to Jerusalem to the hands of the apostles and the elders of the church. When there was a dispute over circumcision and keeping the law of Moses in Acts 15, Paul and Barnabas were sent to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders. When the letter was written back and sent back to Antioch, it says the apostles and the elders. And so you have a second group of men who have to have some manner, I should say, of authority. But why would we think that this secondary group could exercise more authority than the primary group? You see where I'm going with this? If the apostles were not the bosses over the local church, and they were not the bosses. They were the they were the teachers, they were the spokesmen for God to teach the people what God wanted them to know. If the primary group did not exercise that type of authority, where did we ever get the idea that the secondary group would exercise that kind of authority? Now look, I know that y'all don't look at Lynn and Walter as being the bosses over this church. I know you don't. I mean, just by the way that we all interact with one another tells us that we don't that's not the case. Because people that are in those types of relationships, don't hang out with their bosses the way that we spend time together, right? And so we understand this, but sometimes I want us to be, or at times I want us to be careful. I want us to be careful that we don't misunderstand the relationship that the elders, that we have to our elders and the relationship that the elders have toward us. All right? The elders are not our bosses. They're not our bosses. Now, I guess there's a sense in which they might be my boss. But only in the sense that they have been the delegates of divine authority. And the elders have the right to tell me, look, you haven't preached on this in a long time. We need you to preach on this. We want you to preach on this. I mean, it's perfectly fine, right? If they tell me that, what am I going to do? I'm going to preach on it until they tell me to stop. Right? I'm going to preach on it until I get done what they want done. Why? Because it's their job to make sure the congregation is fed. Right? Now, with that in mind, that's where we're going to stop. Because we're starting to get into responsibilities, specific responsibilities that elders have regarding the church. And I don't want to introduce it and get very far into it and then have to stop. So, Lord willing, next week we're going to start on page 114 and the word unfortunately in the first full paragraph. That'll be 11:3. All right, so we'll stop right there for this week.